Have you ever felt as if your life was being written by a hand you could not see? You wake up, you make choices, you believe you're in control, yet, when you look back, the patterns are undeniable. You keep repeating the same mistakes. You fall in love with the same type of people. You sabotage yourself in ways you swore you never would. It is as if some hidden playwright, buried deep inside of you, is scripting your story long before you step onto the stage. Most of us believe we are the authors of our destiny. We imagine ourselves sitting in the director's chair of our mind. But Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who dared to look deeper than anyone before him, revealed a brutal truth. What we call conscious choice is often nothing more than the echo of an ancient script, rehearsed for centuries, whispered by forces we do not understand. Think of an iceberg. What you see above the water is your conscious mind, your thoughts, your decisions, your sense of self. But beneath the surface, vast, cold, and largely unexplored, lies the unconscious. And it is this unseen mass that determines the drift of your life. You may steer the ship at the top, but the hidden weight below dictates the course. Jung's life was dedicated to this one question. How can we make the unseen seen? How can we take back the steering wheel from the forces that secretly drive us? In this video, we will walk through Jung's extraordinary journey, his childhood, his friendship and eventual rupture with Freud, his descent into personal crisis, and the monumental discoveries that emerged from it. We'll explore his map of the psyche, the ego, the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, and the self. And most importantly, we'll see how Jung's ideas can transform the way you see yourself, how they can reveal the hidden hand writing your story, and how you can finally take the pen back. But before we begin, I must warn you, this journey is not comfortable. Because to understand Jung is to look in the mirror and admit that the stranger staring back at you is also you. Your shadow. Your unlived life. Your hidden desires and repressed fears. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So prepare yourself. The road we are about to travel is not paved with easy optimism, it is carved into the stone of the psyche, where your demons live alongside your angels. And it begins, as all great stories do, with a child who felt both invisible to the world and haunted by it. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875, in the quiet Swiss village of Keswil, near the shimmering waters of Lake Constance. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary childhood in a small, rural town. But Jung's world was far from ordinary. His father, Paul Jung, was a Protestant pastor, gentle, dutiful, yet weighed down by poverty and a silent resignation to life. His mother, Emily, was eccentric, unpredictable, and often claimed to see spirits that no one else could perceive. Within this strange household, young Carl lived between two worlds, the rigid discipline of religion and the mysterious pull of the unseen. He was an isolated, introverted child. While other children played together in the fields, Carl spent long hours alone, crafting imaginary worlds, speaking to figures only he could see, and building elaborate fantasies. He would later confess that these inner dramas were not mere games, but profound experiences that shaped his earliest sense of reality. School, however, was his torment. He hated it, despised the mechanical recitation of facts, and often underperformed. The anxiety was so intense that he developed psychosomatic fainting spells. Whenever he felt overwhelmed, his body would simply collapse. These episodes were not lies, his psyche itself was rebelling against a world that demanded conformity he could not give. But one day, everything shifted. His father, frustrated and fearful, told him bluntly that if he continued down this path, he would become nothing, no career, no future, no life. This moment pierced Jung's inner world like a blade. Something awakened. Almost overnight, he began to throw himself into his studies with an intensity that astonished his teachers. He read voraciously, far beyond the curriculum, philosophy, mythology, religion. He was searching, even then, for a map of the hidden world within. When the time came to choose a profession, he faced the expectations of his family. His lineage was full of clergymen. His destiny, it seemed, was to follow the pulpit. But Jung resisted. He had seen his father's resignation, his quiet despair. Religion offered answers, but for Jung, they were not enough. He wanted to probe deeper, to find truths not handed down in sermons but discovered in the depths of the human soul. So he turned to medicine. At the University of Basel, and later Zurich, he immersed himself in the sciences, but even here, he was not satisfied with the purely physical. Anatomy and biology revealed the mechanisms of the body, but what of the spirit? What of the mind that dreamed, the heart that despaired, the imagination that created gods and monsters? For Jung, medicine was only the doorway. Psychiatry was the path. He earned his medical degree in 1902, and soon after began working under the renowned psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler at the Burgosli Hospital in Zurich. The Burgosli was not a place of healing in the modern sense, it was a vast institution for the mentally ill, many of them forgotten by society. Yet for Jung, it was a living laboratory of the psyche. He observed patients speaking in fragmented myths, dreaming archetypal dreams, weaving strange and symbolic narratives. To others, these were symptoms of madness. To Jung, they were keys. He began to see that the human mind was not random chaos, but a system, a deep and ordered cosmos with its own laws and structures, laws that connected the sane with the insane, the conscious with the unconscious. And it was in this world that Jung's path would intersect with another man whose name already loomed over the field like a titan, Sigmund Freud. By the time Jung was establishing himself as a promising young psychiatrist, another figure had already captured the imagination of Europe, Sigmund Freud. Brilliant, controversial, and fearless, Freud had laid the foundations of psychoanalysis, declaring that human behavior was driven not by reason, but by unconscious desires, above all, sexual ones. To many, Freud was a scandalous voice. To others, he was a revolutionary. To Jung, he was both a mentor and a mystery. In 1907, Jung and Freud met for the first time in Vienna. What was supposed to be a polite professional introduction became a marathon conversation that lasted nearly 13 hours. Neither man could stop talking. They spoke of dreams, of myths, of repression, of the hidden currents beneath the surface of consciousness. Jung, still relatively unknown, found in Freud a father figure, someone who gave legitimacy to his growing intuition that the human mind was far deeper than most dared to admit. Their friendship blossomed. They wrote letters constantly. They traveled together, lectured side by side, and even analyzed one another's dreams. Freud declared Jung his intellectual heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. For Jung, it was both an honor and a burden. But beneath the warmth, cracks were forming. Freud was older, more established, and far more rigid in his theories. He insisted that sexuality was the central force in the unconscious, the root of neurosis, the hidden truth of all human motivation. Jung admired Freud's genius, but he felt constrained by this narrow lens. To Jung, the psyche was not only about sex or childhood trauma, it was vast, symbolic, spiritual. He began to see patterns that Freud dismissed, recurring images across patients' dreams, motifs that echoed the myths and stories of ancient cultures, visions that spoke of something collective rather than purely personal. The tension grew. What began as minor disagreements became deeper rifts. Jung's mystical leanings made Freud uneasy. Freud's reductionism made Jung restless. And their personal dynamic didn't help. Freud often treated Jung as a son, admired, but expected to obey. Jung, however, was not content to be anyone's disciple. By 1913, the break was inevitable. Their letters became colder, their conversations sharper. Finally, the bond shattered. Jung walked away from Freud, from the psychoanalytic movement, and from the role of heir apparent. But this was no simple professional split. For Jung, it was a psychological earthquake. The man who had been mentor, friend, and father figure was now gone. And in the silence left behind, Jung began to descend into the darkest period of his life. It was a descent not into madness, but into something far more dangerous and transformative, the depths of his own unconscious. When Jung parted ways with Freud in 1913, the rupture was not only intellectual, it was existential. He had lost his mentor, his professional circle, and the movement that gave him identity. He stood alone, cut off from the structure that had defined him. And in that isolation, his psyche began to unravel. From 1913 to 1918, Jung entered what he later described as a period of profound psychological crisis. On the outside, he continued his medical practice, treating patients, lecturing, and writing. But privately, his nights were consumed by visions that terrified him. He dreamed of oceans of blood flooding across Europe, images that seemed prophetic of the First World War, which broke out only a year later. He saw gods, monsters, and figures that felt at once personal and universal. Many would have called it madness. Jung himself feared he might be losing his mind. But instead of resisting, he made a radical decision to confront it directly. He began conducting experiments on himself, recording his dreams, visions, and fantasies in meticulous detail. He painted, he wrote, he dialogued with figures that appeared in his imagination as if they were real beings. These inner journeys would later be compiled into what is now known as the Red Book, a massive, illustrated manuscript where Jung poured the raw material of his unconscious. What he discovered in those years would shape the rest of his life's work. He realized that the unconscious was not merely a reservoir of repressed desires, as Freud had claimed, but an active, creative force. It contained patterns, symbols, and structures that were shared across humanity. It was not chaos, but cosmos. Jung saw that within each person lived not just personal memories, but echoes of myth, religion, and ancestral experience. He called this deeper layer the collective unconscious. And within it resided archetypes, universal motifs like the hero, the mother, the shadow, that appeared in myths, dreams, and stories across cultures and eras. This revelation was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because it meant that no individual truly belonged only to themselves. We all carried the weight of human history within us. Liberating, because it showed that the psyche had an order, a map, a structure that could be explored. But this exploration came at a price. Jung described nights of despair, days of disorientation, moments when the boundary between inner vision and outer reality blurred. He knew he could not run from the darkness. As he would later write, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. By confronting his own shadow, his fears, his insecurities, his hidden desires, Jung forged a new path for psychology. A path not of repression or denial, but of integration. He realized that wholeness was only possible when the rejected parts of the self were brought into the light. Out of crisis, Jung was reborn, not as Freud's disciple, but as an independent thinker. His theories of the psyche, the unconscious, the shadow, and individuation began to crystallize. And what emerged was not only a new vision of psychology, but a new philosophy of life itself. Because for Jung, the question was no longer, how do we cure mental illness? It became, how do we become whole human beings? And to answer that, we must first understand the architecture of the psyche itself. After years of confrontation with his own unconscious, Jung began to piece together a map of the psyche, a structure that could explain not only his visions, but the dreams, behaviors, and conflicts of every human being. He saw the psyche not as a single surface, but as a layered world. At the top was consciousness, the realm of daily awareness, decisions, and rational thought. At the center of this realm sat the ego, the part of us that says I, weaving our experiences into a continuous story of identity. But Jung quickly realized that the ego was not the whole. It was only a fragment, like the tip of a mountain above the clouds. Around the ego was the persona, the mask we wear in society, the version of ourselves adapted to survive, to be accepted, to play roles. Your job title, your polite smile, your best self on social media, these are expressions of the persona. Necessary, yes. But dangerous if mistaken for the true self. Because beneath the mask lies everything the ego refuses to see. Jung called this the shadow. The shadow contains the rejected parts of ourselves, the envy we deny, the fears we hide, the impulses we repress, the truths we dare not admit. Many people spend their lives running from their shadow, projecting it onto others, condemning in the world what they cannot face within themselves. But the shadow never disappears. Denied, it grows darker. Ignored, it controls us from behind the curtain. Yet Jung insisted, the shadow is not only negative. It also contains untapped potential, creativity, vitality, authenticity. The very traits we long for are often hidden in the darkness we refuse to explore. To integrate the shadow is not to destroy it, but to embrace it as part of ourselves. But the unconscious is deeper still. Beneath the personal shadow lies what Jung called the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of symbols and images shared across humanity. He discovered this through his patients' dreams, which often contained myths and motifs they had never studied or known, yet which mirrored ancient stories from distant cultures. Within this collective unconscious live the archetypes, universal patterns of the human psyche. The hero, the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the child. They appear in myths, religions, and stories across every culture. They are not learned, they are inherited. They shape our imagination, our fears, our aspirations. Among the most powerful archetypes are the anima and the animus. Jung believed that every man carries an inner feminine image, the anima, while every woman carries an inner masculine image, the animus. These figures live within us, influencing our relationships, our attractions, and our inner balance. They represent the parts of ourselves that remain unexpressed, waiting for integration. At the very center of all these layers lies what Jung called the self. Not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of who we are, the conscious and the unconscious united. The self is the true center of the psyche, the wholeness toward which we are always moving, whether we realize it or not. To live a fulfilled life, Jung argued, is not to inflate the ego or polish the persona, but to bring these fragments into harmony with the deeper self. This process, he called individuation. Individuation is the journey of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, embracing the anima or animus, and aligning the ego with the self. It is not the pursuit of perfection, but of authenticity. It is not about escaping darkness, but about learning to carry both light and shadow within. As Jung once wrote, man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. But this task is not easy. It demands radical honesty, deep self-reflection, and the courage to see what most would rather leave hidden. And so the question emerges, if individuation is our task, how do we begin this journey? How do we move from living on the surface, trapped in ego and persona, to the deeper work of wholeness? That is the challenge of individuation. And it is the subject of our next part. For Jung, the greatest tragedy of human life was not failure, not loss, not even death. It was to live an unlived life, to remain a stranger to yourself, trapped in masks and roles, never touching the deeper truth of who you are. This is why he placed the process of individuation at the very center of his psychology. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. It is the lifelong journey of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, of integrating your light and your shadow, your masculine and feminine, your ego and your deeper self. But individuation begins with a difficult task: radical honesty. You must be willing to look at yourself without masks. To admit your flaws, your envies, your secret desires, your shame. To stop blaming the world for every wound and instead ask, what part of this pain belongs to me? What does it reveal about my shadow? This honesty leads to the second step: integration of the shadow. Jung warned that what we resist persists. The more you repress anger, jealousy, or fear, the more powerfully they return, disguised and uncontrollable. But when you acknowledge them, when you say, yes, this too is part of me, something shifts. You stop being a puppet of the shadow and begin to integrate it as energy, as strength, as authenticity. Individuation also requires encountering the anima or animus within. For men, this means listening to the inner feminine, the voice of sensitivity, intuition, feeling. For women, it means embracing the inner masculine, the voice of reason, strength, and direction. By integrating these neglected aspects, we become more balanced, more complete. But the most profound step in individuation is the gradual alignment of the ego with the self. The ego, left unchecked, believes it is the center of the universe. It clings to control, to identity, to safety. But the self is larger, wiser, deeper. When the ego yields to the self, life begins to feel guided, not by external forces, but by an inner compass aligned with truth. This path, however, is not without pain. Individuation often feels like a death, the death of illusions, of false identities, of attachments that no longer serve you. Jung himself experienced this in his own crisis. He had to let go of being Freud's heir, of being defined by others' expectations, of being who the world thought he should be. Only then could he discover who he really was. To individuate is to descend into your own depths, to walk through the valley of your fears, to sit with your darkness without running away. But it is also to rise, renewed, with a clearer sense of purpose, strength, and meaning. Jung described it as a rebirth. And like all births, it is messy, painful, and uncertain. But what waits on the other side is nothing less than authenticity, the ability to live a life that is truly your own. And yet, individuation is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong journey. Each confrontation with conflict, each crisis, each relationship, is an invitation to go deeper. Every disappointment is a mirror. Every joy, a reminder of what is possible when you live from the center of your being. But how does this play out in daily life? What does individuation mean for your relationships, your choices, your struggles in the modern world? That is what we will explore in the next part. Because the greatest challenge is not to understand individuation in theory, but to embody it in practice. It is one thing to speak of individuation in the abstract, to describe the integration of the shadow and the alignment with the self. It is another to live it in the chaos of daily existence. Because individuation does not happen in monasteries alone, nor only in therapy rooms. It happens in your marriage, in your career, in your friendships, in every argument, in every sleepless night. Jung insisted that the unconscious is not a distant land. It speaks to us constantly, through dreams, through slips of the tongue, through the emotions we cannot explain, through the people who trigger us most. To ignore these messages is to wander blindly. To listen is to begin to navigate with awareness. Take relationships, for example. How many times have you found yourself drawn to people who mirror your wounds? The partner who awakens your jealousy, the friend who always seems to compete with you, the boss who stirs your resentment. Jung would say, this is not coincidence. These figures are carrying pieces of your shadow, forcing you to see what you refuse to own in yourself. If you run, you repeat the cycle. If you reflect, you grow. Or consider success and failure. Many people strive endlessly for recognition, wealth, or approval, believing that these will make them whole. But Jung warned that when the ego pursues goals disconnected from the self, the result is emptiness, even despair. True purpose emerges only when you align outward actions with inward truth. Otherwise, you achieve everything and still feel nothing. Another challenge is the modern obsession with persona. Social media amplifies this mask to extremes. We curate images, we polish our smiles, we measure our worth in likes and shares. But the more we identify with the persona, the more distant we become from the self. Jung would remind us, the mask is necessary, but it is not you. To mistake the mask for the soul is to live in illusion. Then there is the question of suffering. Most people see suffering as an enemy, something to avoid at all costs. But Jung turned this upside down. He believed suffering was often the very doorway to transformation. Depression, anxiety, loss, these are not just pathologies, but invitations to explore what the unconscious is demanding we confront. As he wrote, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Yet this is perhaps the hardest truth to accept. Because facing pain requires courage. It means stepping into discomfort when every instinct tells you to escape. It means listening to the voice you have silenced for years. It means admitting that the problem is not only the world out there, but also the world within. And this is why individuation is rare. Many prefer distraction over reflection, comfort over growth, illusion over truth. They spend their lives running from the shadow, only to discover, too late, that the shadow was running them all along. But for those willing to walk this path, individuation becomes the foundation of freedom. Freedom not from pain, but from being controlled by it. Freedom not from the unconscious, but through conscious relationship with it. Freedom not from darkness, but from blindness to it. This is the gift of Jung's work, a reminder that life is not about perfection, but about wholeness. And wholeness is messy. It means carrying contradictions. It means holding light and shadow in the same hands. It means being fully human. And this leads us to the final step of our journey, the conclusion of Jung's vision. A vision not only of psychology, but of existence itself. Carl Jung once wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." Jung's gift to us was not a set of simple answers, but a map. A map of the psyche, of the inner cosmos, of the hidden architecture that shapes our lives. But a map is useless unless you dare to travel. And that is the challenge I leave with you. Will you continue to live on the surface, repeating patterns, clinging to masks, running from your shadow? Or will you take the risk of turning inward, of confronting the darkness, of walking toward wholeness? Because in the end, individuation is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming who you truly are. Not the persona you display, not the ego you defend, but the self that has always been waiting beneath. Yes, the journey is painful. Yes, it will cost you illusions, comfort, and perhaps relationships that depended on your masks. But what you gain is beyond measure: clarity, authenticity, freedom. Jung believed that the purpose of human existence was to bring light into the darkness, not by denying the darkness, but by embracing it. And in doing so, to awaken. So now I ask you, are you ready to awaken? Are you ready to see yourself not only as you appear, but as you are? If this message resonated with you, let me know in the comments. I choose wholeness. Let's see how many here are willing to step onto this path of individuation. And don't stop here. The next video will take you even deeper into Jung's insights and give you the tools to begin integrating these truths into your own life. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Because this is not just psychology. This is the journey of being human.